there will be almost 57,000 new polling units for Nigeria's 2020 elections, with Lagos and Kano having the largest. The Independent National Electoral Commission says there are now almost 177,000 polling stations across the country. More than 700 units have been removed from inappropriate facilities, including shrines, churches, royal palaces, and private property. Inec has fixed June 18th and July 16th for governorship elections in Ekiti and Osun states.
Following several unsuccessful attempts to create additional polling units, despite the obvious pressure from increased number of registered voters, the Commission established the voting points and voting point settlements across the states of the Federation and the Federal Capital Territory as a pragmatic response to necessity. The voting points were tied to the existing polling units and voting point settlements. The number of registered voters in a polling unit and the voting point settlement in the FCT was used to determine their voting points based on the upper threshold of 500, a lower threshold of 700 voters respectively. There were also limits used. These were also the limits used for the 2019 general election. The number of new polling units in a state is the number of voting points aggregated from these polling units, particularly those having voting points.
This is great news coming from Inec, Dr. Abati, and I think the whole point of this exercise is to boost voter turnout, which has steadily declined since 1999. It's dropped 19%, whereas the number of registered voters continues to multiply. This is the first time in a generation that this is happening, that we're actually getting new polling units, the first time in 25 years. So what that tells you, paints a picture of how people have to travel great distances and stay in long queues just to exercise their civic rights. So the whole idea is to let Nigerians know that INEC is trying to make the process a lot less painful for them and a lot more convenient. And also with COVID-19, it's timely at this point. And what INEC, I think, is just trying to stress is that to make Nigeria as pro-democracy as possible, as to make it as easy as possible for Nigerians to exercise their franchise. So this is them trying to do their bit. And I hope that political parties pick up this challenge as well, because the other issue with voter turnout is when people fear for their lives, quite justifiably in a lot of parts of Nigeria, and they just stay at home on election day because they're scared of getting shot. I mean, that is it's such an indictment about the way the political process is handled. So political parties need to do their part, just as INEC is finally doing their part after numerous attempts at creating new polling units, which have failed over the years due to the issue being politicized, as I'm sure even this exercise will be politicized.
Okay, yes, it's a very good development and the transparent manner in which INEC has handled the exercise with the participation, with the involvement of other stakeholders, including civil society. I think it's commendable. And now the outcome of that process, which INEC has been known for a while, has now been made public. I think further details should also be made available to the stakeholders involved, particularly the political parties. Now, it would increase participation, it would deepen the democratic process, and it will also, provide greater clarity to the electorate in terms of where they should vote. However, we should note that what they've done is to turn many of the voting points that INEC had to come up with as the number of the electorate increased and, polling units became inadequate. INEC then proceeded to create voting points, because the last time new polling units were designated was 25 years ago. So many of those voting points arising from those polling units in designated areas have now been turned into polling units of their own. Now, the only thing to note is that INEC says the next by-elections in Kaduna State, in Jigawa, in Plateau State will still use those voting points that were used in the 2019 general election. But that will be the last time that there will be designated voting points. There will only be voting units. Before now, we had about 119,000+ polling units, but the figure now has gone up by about 56,182, giving a total of 176 plus. Now, what is important, in my view, is that, this has been done. The first time that these polling units will be put to work will be on November 6, 2021, when INEC will conduct the Anambra governorship elections. And if you look at the distribution, the northern part of the country, the 19 states plus the FCT have over 45,000 polling units. The rest, over 36,000 plus, are in the southern part of the country. Now, there was also another point that the chairman of INEC made, which I think we should take note of. The fact that over 700 polling units have been removed from private residences, from shrines, and from other places of worship.
Yes, in the report.
That, I think, is also something that is commendable. Because, indeed, during the 2019 elections, I was shocked to discover that some traditional rulers had voting units inside their palaces. And they would go and sit down there and dictate how people should vote. So, doing that is also very good. Nobody should turn his personal home into a polling unit where he will have a control over, what transpires at that particular polling unit. But beyond all of this, I think we still need to worry about two major issues. The first major issue has to do with the framework, the legal framework for the election. The Electoral Amendment Bill is still before the National Assembly. Ahead of the 2019 general election, that bill could not be signed into law. The excuse then was that it was too close to the election. This present assembly, the Senate president, when they assumed office, said very clearly that that will be made a priority. Now, how many months do we have to the general elections in 2023? Nobody is, addressing that issue of the electoral law with the urgency that it requires. The second issue has to do with security. INEC had visited the president recently to report that, its facilities are threatened and there are issues in different parts of the country. In a release before then, in a press statement before then, INEC, in fact, described the security challenge that it faces as a national emergency. So the question to ask is, okay, what are we doing to ensure security? Security, not just of these polling units that have been defined, particularly in certain sensitive parts of the country, but also the security of ad hoc staff for INEC, because INEC doesn't have enough staff to conduct elections in all these polling units that have been announced. They will need ad hoc staff. At a time, there is a major security challenge in the country. Will anybody want to go and be INEC ad hoc staff and be kidnapped, or get shot, or get caught in the crossfire, of violence and all of that? So these are some of the issues. But at the level of preparing and all of that, and the announcement of the elections that will take place in Ekiti State and Ondo State in 2022, where that's early notification enough. But there are issues about the legal framework and also about the security that will have to be dealt with, not just by INEC itself, by other stakeholders involved in the process as we prepare for 2023. And the Anambra election will be a major test case for INEC.
Thank you, Dr. Abati. Well, that's all on the news headlines. We'll take a short break now. When we return, we'll have Rosa Sadiri, Michael Wilson, Adesua Moran, and Erona Kerejala to give us updates on Africa and global business, COVID-19, and sporting activities across the globe. Stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Joining us now is our dependable Rosa Sadiri with an African business update. Good morning, Rotis.
Good morning, Tundu. Good morning, Doctor. Good morning to all our viewers. We kick off with oil prices. Crude oil in particular, it's come down a bit over the last 24 hours, which is why you probably see the red decimals to the right of your screen. So it's about $74 now, but it did touch $75. So it's continuing to rise. Michael Wilson, I guess we'll get more into that on the global front. Well, specifically for Nigeria, if you remember the exclusive interview that we had with the country director for Nigeria from the World Bank and the lead economist, Shabam Chuduri, Marco Hernandez, they warned of rising crude and what it would mean for the landing cost of fuel. So if you look at the fact that, there's a positive demand outlook and there's also the talk of inventory draws and so on. Again, Michael Wilson might get into that on the U.S. side. As far as inventories are concerned, that's what's pushing up oil prices. It's a double-edged sword, right? So if you think it's good for us that you see crude rising with respect to what it means for FX inflows and so on and so forth, with the amount of dollars that come in. But the other side of that double-edged sword is that when you think about fuel stations and people buying fuel and so on and so forth, that landing cost is going to rise. In fact, we need to get an update from the NNPC with respect to where the landing cost of fuel is, because last time they were talking about, I think it was 170 or 180 naira landing cost, while we're selling at 162. But that was back in January or February that I believe they gave us that last update. So since that time, with crude now almost touching $74, or rather almost touching $75 a barrel and coming down, we have to get an update. It's surely the landing cost has risen. So if that landing cost has gone up, that's, 73, 74 naira subsidy cost per liter of fuel that the NNPC is covering as the sole importer. That has definitely gone up, which is only going to make all the issues that the NNPC has talked about with respect to crude oil just increase when it, what gets remitted to the Federation accounts. The amount of projects that have opportunity cost of the projects that they haven't been able to fund. We talked about 6 of them to the tune of 27 billion naira that weren't able to be funded. So, again, once we get that update from them, even all the PPPRA, they've all come out and talked about, the need to end the subsidy regime. This just adds to it. So again, you can celebrate rising crude, but then because of the lack of refineries, once more, this is going to increase costs. To MTN. MTN, biggest telecom operator in Nigeria, has sent out a note to certain customers that was seen by media, by the newspaper, warned of insecurity in impacting their operations. When you think of where their base stations are located, they need to be fueled. Individuals have to go out there and check and do maintenance and so on and so forth. They actually sent out a notice to customers saying, hey, look, you might have a bit of a service disruption because we're not able to go out there and review these base stations. So I think they're the first company that has come out openly and acknowledged the fact that the insecurity situation around the country is impacting them. And of course, in your, Tundu and Doctor, your exclusive interview with President Buhari, insecurity was one of the main issues that was discussed that day, where the president said that, who's going to come into the country to invest when you have these high levels of insecurity. That's one angle. That's FDI that's probably not in yet, that may be deterred. What about the businesses that are already here? So it's this is an issue now that is just, you would think power, corruption are the big issues, but this insecurity thing, it has spread now to everywhere. It's affected. It's going to have, think about the cascading effect of disruptions in telecom service and what that does for a business who needs to make calls and send text and so on and so forth. What that does for WhatsApp groups where businesses, with staff meet together to coordinate. I mean, it's a cascading effect, and MTN Nigeria is 1/3 of MTN's revenues. It's the most lucrative market. Nigeria is the most lucrative market for MTN out of the 22 countries that it operates in between Africa and the Middle East. So it's sizable for MTN Nigeria to come out and say that, look, this is what could possibly be happening with respect to how our services might be disrupted due to insecurity. So we got to move quickly as far as the federal government is concerned. Finally, Ben Akabweze, very interesting comments from him, who, of course, he's been on the morning show in the past. This is the Director General of the Budget Office. At the launch of the World Bank's report, he did say that with respect to cost of governance, cutting the budget allocations to ministries, departments, and agencies aren't going to do much. So what he was saying, essentially, when folks talk about the cost of governance, cut it down. He used an example. He used the legislature, the National Assembly. And he says the National Assembly budget is 128 billion naira. He says if you bring it down to zero, what is the impact as a ratio of the National Assembly budget to the total budget, which is 13 trillion naira. 128 billion as a percentage of 13 trillion is 0.98%. It's barely 1%. So he was like, even if you completely cut it off, it doesn't make much of a difference. The overarching point Ben Akabweze was trying to make was that he said target the subsidies. Remove the subsidies. That is the biggest cost to us. So, look, overall here, NNPC, Group Managing Director Mele Kyari, the Petroleum Products Pricing Regulatory Agency, the World Bank, Ben Akabweze, you are seeing this growing sentiment here where Nigeria has to get rid of these fuel subsidies in order to bring down the costs and try to allocate that to other avenues. That's our update.
Well, thank you, Rotas. I don't think anybody who has the best interests of this country at heart would argue with that call to focus on the subsidies. But before you shared this story, I told you, Rotas, I actually bookmarked this Ben Akabweze's comments to read later. So thank you for, letting me read it beforehand. I have to disagree with the first half of what he said, I'm afraid, most respectfully, because we cannot afford, as a nation, any form of profligacy. And he's looking at the big picture. He's looking at 128 billion naira as a drop in the ocean or a dot in the circle, if you like. However, I'd like to put that 128 billion into context. Education budget 2021 was 742.5 billion naira, which is quite dismal, actually. So 128 billion naira is actually 17% of the education budget. 17% would go quite far. UBEC, Universal Basic Education's budget, entire budget for 2021, 77.6 billion naira. So you cannot see 128 billion naira as a drop in the ocean, that amount that he attributed to the legislature. And he also said federal government agencies cost us as a country 425 billion naira, also framing that as also a drop in the ocean. But now you can see, with the context that I've given, it's actually not. It will go far in, ameliorating a lot of the suffering of a lot of Nigerians. The health budget, which is also quite dismal. Health capital expenditure, I'm not talking about recurrent expenditure. Capital expenditure for an entire year is 132 billion naira. So I disagree on that point with Ben Akabweze.
Okay, first let me start with the MTN alleged disruption of services. I think there is an update to that story. First, we were told that the statement was issued by MTN South Africa. Second, MTN Nigeria said, they were not aware of it in some of the stories that reported it. But this morning, there is said to be a statement by MTN Nigeria CEO, Toriola, saying that, the initial statement that people were referring to about disruption of services is a routine notification to certain businesses in specific areas facing challenges, and not a nationwide disruption. And that MTN Nigeria is committed to providing quality service, and that if there is going to be any disruption, either due to faults or to any kind of, challenge, that will be appropriately communicated. And he went on to talk about 5 drivers, how they are trying to, get into partnerships, deepen their network impact. However, the point that was originally raised about insecurity is correct. It affects everybody, whether you are into telecom or you are running a small and medium-scale enterprises. Some of those base stations that telecom companies run, they are in isolated locations, and they do it with contractors. They maintain them with contractors. In a season of kidnap, it's a major challenge. Ben Akabweze is talking about salaries reduction not having an effect on revenue flow. No, I think it's wrong. People are not talking about salaries alone. They are talking about the size of government. I didn't see a comment from him about the size of government. I didn't see a comment from him about the implementation of the Oronsaye report, which is supposed to allow, our government to become leaner, to shed fat. And I didn't see a comment also about the retinue of vehicles, about the cost of governance itself. Maybe if we look in those directions, maybe yes, some revenue may be saved, some money may be saved for more productive purposes. And the long talk about the diversification of the economy. These are some of the issues always addressed annually at the Economic Summit Group of Nigeria, but government has not followed through on some of those key considerations that we just talked about and dump on the table.
Well, thank you, Rotis. But now we're moving on to global business updates, and for that, we're being joined by Michael Wilson from London. Good morning, Mr. Wilson.
Good morning. Yeah, a bit of a curveball, really, from the FOMC yesterday in the United States. The idea, two things came out of it, basically, that interest rates sort of will be rising. I say sort of because the language is still pretty opaque, quite honestly, but for 2023. And also there may be some kind of talk about tapering off the amount of money that the government, the Treasury rather, in the United States is pumping into the economy. So that really spooked the markets. Asia, though, they're pretty cautious, to be absolutely honest. The market's fairly soft. S&P 500 lost about 0.5%. Dow Jones down 260 points. Dow futures down 100 points for today. Relatively subdued reaction, I think, from Asia, quite honestly. South Korea down, Nikkei 1.3. China, though, in positive territory. It's begun, Reuters reporting, it's begun an antitrust probe into Didi Chuxing, which is China's ride-hailing champion, which is planning an IPO in the United States. Shanghai Composite up very, very slightly indeed. So Asian markets actually relatively soft. I suspect that what they were doing was not worrying about it too much and having worried a couple of days before rather than reacting in this kind of knee-jerk way that the American markets did yesterday. As far as, I know you're going to talk about COVID and the rest of it, but travel executives are pointing to the pretty obvious, basically, by saying that the vaccine recovery will help recovery. This is from AirAsia, hospitality side of Oyo, and the Chinese online travel booking company Trip.com. They're all saying that vaccines will actually help, but Singapore is actually saying that open and free travel within Asia is still a long way away from what people actually want. International travel almost came to an international halt because of the pandemics. Other travel bosses, though, within Europe are seething about what's going on. Jet2, EasyJet, Manchester Airport are criticising the UK government for not putting Spain and the Balearic Islands on their so-called green list, whereas countries like Germany are. So basically, a lot of tourists not being allowed to go there from the UK, but a lot from Europe, other countries within Europe actually going there too. As far as just talking geopolitically, I should touch on the US-Russia talks. They were supposed to be relatively positive, mainly about nuclear talks, and also returning their respective ambassadors to their posts, which is actually quite good, really. Again, it's pretty opaque diplomatic stuff, but it does work. And if these two people are actually talking to each other, then that's pretty good. As far as the United States is concerned, Intel is seeing 10 good years of growth for the chip industry. Again, we've seen the pandemic and the rest of it toughing problems, and there's a chip shortage right now. But Intel is going to spend $20 billion on a chip fabrication plant in Arizona. So things are moving relatively positively there. As far as big tech's concerned, US Republicans are forcing more scrutiny on China tech. This is Kathy McMorris Rogers. She's the top Republican on the powerful House and Energy Commerce Committee. She told Republican members that, that there's going to be much more accountability, they suspect, focusing on China and also focusing on their own companies like Amazon, Apple, Facebook and Google and so on. As far as the UK is concerned, the Treasury getting a windfall from furlough. Investors are saying, pay the money back that you got from the Treasury. So Treasury's got about $1 billion. It's still dwarfed by the 64 billion pounds that they've actually spent, of course, but it's an internal kind of thing. I heard a very, very interesting rumour going around yesterday, which is actually quite strong, that the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, is pretty pleased that people are holidaying in the UK. Why? Because they're not spending money abroad, but they're spending it in the UK economy. Will that have any kind of impact on when lockdown is eventually raised? I couldn't possibly comment about that. New Zealand, trade overtures to the UK. Now, New Zealand's largest trading partner is China. We've seen that trade deal fixed with Australia. Now New Zealand is actually targeting the UK. Talks today with the Trade Minister, Damien O'Connor, that's the New Zealand chap, with our Liz Truss, who is the Trade Minister here, targeting the UK and also the EU as well. As far as the UK is concerned, labour shortages cutting the meat industry, big cuts in the meat industry, lack of production, particularly things like poultry, chicken and the rest of it. As you see there, we depend upon a lot of foreign workers to do that kind of work, and post-Brexit immigration laws are making labour shortages pretty strong. Finally, to commodities, oil weathered that storm yesterday quite well, as Reuters was talking about oil prices continuing to rise. US crude inventories fell by above expected by 7.3 million, nearly 7.4 million barrels overnight. And Brent crude testing $75. Reuters has already been talking about that. And gold, well, you know, FOMC, rising interest rates and so on. So gold's been a bit crushed, quite honestly. It's looking at... well, I'm about $1,840 an ounce. It's nowhere near that sort of 2,000, and it's staged a moderate recovery, but not an enormous amount. So basically, that's on the play of interest rates rising by 2023, possibly in the United States. I only say possibly because we continue this inflation debate, don't we? That's the global view this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Michael, once again. But very quickly, what do you think of the optimism of the FOMC? Headline inflation expectation rate has been put at 3.5. The FOMC is saying, well, GDP growth rate is going to be about 7%. That's different from 6.5%. Quantitative easing will continue. Inflation rate, interest rate unchanged because Jerome Powell and the POMC claim that whatever we have seen is just transitory. So generally, a very optimistic, projection. But you know, how is the market really responding, particularly in the light of the fact that the FOMC is saying that there may be 2 rate hikes in 2022, much earlier than originally planned?
Well, I read it as looking towards 2023 actually, rather than 2022, and I think that's basically what the market has taken it to be. Did I not say that, you know, the Far East markets have actually taken it very much in their stride? There was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in the United States yesterday. I don't really see what all the surprise is about, for precisely the reasons that I've talked about with you on the program over the recent weeks. That, you know, clearly the economies are recovering when they do, when vaccinations start to get down through the ages in the economies and starting to recover relatively quickly. I think we should encourage that. I have to say, are you particularly worried about interest rates going up in 2 years' time? I have to say I'm not. And I think that, you know, a bit of inflation is probably quite healthy. I do feel as though the central banks need to show that they are in control of this. They need not to throw curveballs like this, but they need to say, look, we are still looking through these spikes in inflation, again, for all those reasons we've discussed before. So it's a very difficult one, isn't it, really? I mean, you pay as your money, it takes your choice, really. It's a difficult one. It's a debate still. I don't see much moving, quite honestly. Certainly nothing happening this year. I think really what the Fed is trying to do is to ease the air out of the balloon very, very slightly. And it's very, very difficult to do that. It's all about exit strategies, which, as you know, as we've discussed before, are incredibly difficult.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. To know what's next.
Oh, I thought you were taking us to Adesua, so I get to introduce her. Adesua Morwan is here with COVID-19 pandemic updates. Good morning, Adesua.
Good morning, Tunde, and thank you so much. Good morning, Dr. Abati.
Good morning.
Well, it's definitely different strokes for different folks when it comes to the global pandemic on our hands. As countries reopen and go maskless, others are dealing with their worst infections in months since the pandemic began. This is just as the WHO is warning that the virus is outpacing vaccines. Those are the crucial figures you need to know about on your screen by the Johns Hopkins University, the global infections, the global deaths, and of course, global vaccinations carried out so far. Here in Nigeria, 8 new cases were recorded in the last 24 hours with no deaths from 3 states, including Lagos. And almost 43,000 people got their second jab of coronavirus vaccines in the last 24 hours in Nigeria as well, bringing the total to over 730,000 people who have done that. But I have to bring a quick follow-up for our viewers. Yesterday, we talked about the new directive by the federal government through the NPHCDA, allowing those 18 years and above to get vaccinated as the country is set to receive a second shipment from COVAX. Unfortunately, I have received multiple reports saying that directive remains just a statement made at that press conference by Dr. Faiza Shuaibu. A lot of people who went in to get their first jabs, have been turned back by the centers Here in Lagos, they were told that they don't have such directive from the federal government and they would not open up vaccinations to more people until next month when they are done with the second dose exercise. This means that the federal and state governments at the moment are not in sync with that directive to open up vaccinations to more Nigerians. We do hope that they fix that and would see a united front when it comes to vaccinating the population. Well, away from Nigeria, a day after President Cyril Ramaphosa increased restrictions, South Africa has recorded its highest daily infections in 5 months. Now, the country posted a record 13,246 infections in the last 24 hours. The figure is almost double the weekly average for the past 7 days and compares to 8,436 cases recorded the previous day. The country's Institute for Communicable Diseases said in a statement that these figures represented the highest daily cases as well as positivity rates since January. The situation is not any different in Russia. Russia is grappling with its largest surge in cases since February, with about half of those cases recorded in the capital. Moscow accounted for 5,782 of Russia's over 13,000 new cases recorded on Wednesday. There were 75 deaths in the capital. And after the sharp rise in these cases, Moscow is now making COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for service sector workers, everybody that has to conduct business with the public face-to-face, including teachers, taxi drivers, salons, technicians, name it, you have to be vaccinated mandatory. There was a decree issued yesterday by the mayor. And those who fail to ensure this vaccination, companies who fail to ensure that their workers get vaccinated, risk being fined between $695 and $13,896. European Union members states yesterday agreed to lift travel restrictions on travelers from 8 countries and territories, including the United States. The white list, what is known as that, of countries and regions exempted from this travel ban will be expanded to include Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, Lebanon, the US, as I said, Taiwan, Macau, and Hong Kong. But British travelers are still excluded from the bloc. And finally, the highly anticipated meeting between President Biden and President Putin did not discuss coronavirus in detail. When asked about the subject during his solo presser, the Russian president said COVID-19 came up briefly, and then he then went on ahead to talk about how Russia had helped United States selflessly under the Trump administration by sending them the much-needed ventilators at the time. On his part, when asked about if he would call President Xi Jinping of China to open up to the WHO investigators, he queried China's desire to find the origins of the coronavirus.
Well, thank you, Adeswa. From that report you gave us on Moscow and how public-facing workers are now being compelled to be vaccinated, do you get the sense that the gloves are coming off now? All of these measures were initially subject to debate and people talking about human rights violations, but now it looks like all of that has just flown right out the window. In the UK as well, if you don't get a vaccine, you cannot work in a care home. Otherwise, you can lose your job or be put somewhere else where you don't have to deal with the elderly and vulnerable occupants of that care home. What do you think that this really means in terms of the fight against the pandemic, and also vaccine passports as well, that were initially debated, human rights violations and what have you? It's going ahead, full steam.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Tundra. I think that we are beginning to see different tactics. Some working, some are not working. In Moscow, they are also offering raffle draws to give out cars, expensive apartments, monies as well, but it doesn't seem to be doing the trick just yet. And so perhaps authorities are becoming frustrated. Across the globe, we've seen incentives for vaccination, but the vaccines are not just getting into the arms enough. So we suspect that we are likely to see more push, more aggressive measures from governments across the world as time goes on, Tundun.
Well, very quickly, in Russia, the major problem that they face is that of vaccine skepticism.
Yes.
Russia, out of the 144 million population, only about 18 million people have been vaccinated. And the problem is one of vaccine skepticism. Despite the fact that the Sputnik 5 is in about 61 countries, and it's said to be about 92% effective. But inside Russia itself, you know, they've not been taking it up. Moscow is a particularly disturbing case because out of the over 13,000 infection cases that they had on Wednesday, Moscow alone recorded over 5,700 cases.
Yes.
Hospitalization rate in Moscow at this moment is about 78%. And so, you know, there is that problem. Despite the fact that Sergei Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, a few days ago, had declared, you know, stay-at-home order for workers from June 15 to June 19.
Yeah, 1 week.
Yes, and yet, you know, the numbers continue to go up. There will be penalty, he's now saying, for those offices, businesses that do not vaccinate up to about 60% of their staff. Such businesses could be shut down for up to 90 days, and they could pay a fine of 1 million rubles, which is about $14,000. And all the workers, the public-facing workers that you've talked about, all this is part of an attempt to check the high infection rate that they are facing. As for Nigeria, yes, well, problem of communication, you have identified that. Another thing to identify is that, you know, I've seen some people who maybe took their first dose, say maybe in Kano, maybe when they visited or they went on holiday, only to return to Lagos. And then in Lagos, they are told that because their name is not on the computer, they cannot take a second dose in Lagos. I think that's another thing that should be addressed. Shouldn't it be possible to maybe take your first dose in one state and take your second dose somewhere else, instead of people being told to travel back to where they took their first jab before they can get the second jab?
Well, thank you, Adeswa.